Aidan holds a Master of Architecture from the University of British Columbia, where he was awarded the AIBC Medal for Excellence in Academic Work and Design. Aidan also completed training for the Rick Hansen Foundation certification. Fiona comes from an architecture and advocacy background. She is fascinated by the relationships between physical, social, and infrastructure, and how our built environments can amplify equity and community capacity. Fiona played a pivotal role in developing our latest white paper titled Designing for Inclusivity, Strategies for the Universal Washrooms and Change Rooms, which has garnered more than 20,000 views and shares. Fiona is also developing our own assessment methods to help fill a perceived gap in existing social sustainability evaluation tools. These methods include specific design strategies that relate to the social outcomes of buildings and indoor spaces, and how those experiences, in turn, contribute to community resilience. Now I'd like to introduce Fiona and Aidan to begin their main presentation, although I actually have one more little blurb here. Sorry. Designing buildings to be widely inclusive is a fundamental responsibility of all involved in the process. However, understanding what it takes to go beyond the minimum code requirements can be challenging. This session will help accessibility professionals dispel potential client concerns by sharing the results of a research project that analyzed the added construction costs in relation to accessibility certification for new buildings. Now, I'd like to introduce Fiona and Aidan to begin their main presentation.
Hi, Uli. Thank you all for joining us today. We were really excited to be here and to get to share with you the results of the study that we've been working with the Rick Hansen Foundation on for about a year now. So we're just going to get started. And I just wanted to note that during the webinar, if you have questions, Uli and Michelle from the Foundation will be tracking your questions, and then at the end we will answer any questions that you have. We wanted to start out with a bit of a teaser. So we wanted, on the slide here, you see the number 1%. So we hope that you leave this webinar with this number. We hope you walk away with this number, and we'll get into what it means and the impact of it as we go through the presentation. So on this slide, here's just a couple of images of Fiona and myself, just so you get a visual. Thank you for the introduction, Uli. We thought we'd share a little bit about who we are as a firm and what our purpose is. So HCMA is an interdisciplinary design firm, and we design buildings, brands, and experiences. And we are located in Vancouver, Victoria, and Edmonton. We have 3 different offices. And on this slide here, you can see a map of Canada, and we are very fortunate to get to work on projects all across Canada. We have over 100 employees, and we're proud to say that over 50% of our employees are women. And a bit about our purpose and what drives us. So on this slide here, you can see an image of a 3-legged stool. So this is traditionally what was thought of in terms of sustainability, that there's really 3 equal parts to sustainability, one being social, one being environmental, and one being economic. And what we've seen on this next slide is that there's really been a disproportionate focus on environmental over the past number of years. And environmental is, of course, very important, but what we believe is that we need to be focusing more on the social as well. And what we believe is that through really focusing on the social, we can all achieve what we call responsible design. And through responsible design, what our firm, we believe we can achieve our purpose, which is to maximize positive impact. So we share a bit of backstory. I think everyone that works in accessibility has a story as to why they started working in accessibility and how they changed their focus. And so in 1999, Daryl Condon, the managing partner of HCMA, worked on the Walnut Grove Community Center. So this community center opened in 1999. It won a lot of awards. It was really well received. But what had the most impact actually on our firm was not the awards. It was actually a letter that a parent wrote to Daryl. And in this letter, this individual identified their child could not use the facility because, unfortunately, it was not accessible. So this is an image of the pool. And we do a lot of work like this. Daryl had just had a child. He had followed building code, and so in his mind, we had done what was right, but clearly we had not done enough. And that kind of started us on our journey in accessibility. And unfortunately, what we're seeing being celebrated internationally are images like this picture on the screen of the Tianjin Library. These are internationally celebrated architecture projects that really aren't accessible. And what we believe as a firm is that our focus has really shifted towards universal design. We have a couple additional resources that we could share with you that you can find on our website. We saw a gap a few years ago in knowledge on how to design universal washrooms and change rooms. And so this document that we created a few years ago has been used quite widely. But what we've done is shared a series of design strategies to help designers and decision makers understand how to design a universal washrooms and change rooms so that all participants feel welcome and included. We've also done a bunch of work with the City of Vancouver and other municipalities. So this is an image on the screen, which is a series of images of an individual named Laura McEnroe, which a number of you may be aware of. She's a member of the Persons with Disabilities Advisory Committee. She's a great advocate for accessibility. And for us, really, we just wanted to share this because for us, accessibility is really, once we understand the why behind accessibility, we then understand why design features are required and important, and working with people's lived experiences is just so powerful as part of our story. And so through all this work, what we believe is that actually building codes are the worst. I mean, they're the requirements, so we have to meet them, but they're the worst. And they're the worst that we can do. And so as advocates and as designers and as decision makers, we believe that we can do better, and that building code compliance is not enough. And that's why it's great that there's organizations like Rick Hansen that are creating accessibility standards and the rating systems that they've created to push things forward. And what we really like about this system is that it's really about celebrating meaningful access. And through this, we've actually seen an impact in our practice over the past year. And we're now working with numerous clients that are targeting Rick Hansen goals. And we've developed new processes internally where we're ensuring that accessibility and the Rick Hansen system is being considered. So this is what you see on the screen here is just a screen capture of a spreadsheet that we've created that helps designers understand when they should start thinking about certain features and design features throughout the design, and which consultants should also be aware of these design features. And this is just an image of the Grandview Heights Aquatic Center, which we were excited that last year received gold certification. For all of this, we kind of relate this back to the transformation that we've seen over the past 20 years with the rating system of LEED, which is leadership in energy and environmental design. And so over the past 20 years, since LEED has been implemented, we've really seen a shift where requirements identified in LEED 20 years ago are now being implemented in part of building code. Things like ASHRAE that are now energy requirements. And so what we really hope is that similar to LEED, that over the next short period of time, hopefully not 20 years, we'll start to see a big change and see these requirements actually embedded in building code. Now we'll lead, that's a bit about who we are and what we believe. Now we're going to jump to the cost comparison feasibility study, where we're going to share some of the objectives, methodology, and the results of the study with you.
Great. So before we jump into sharing the processes and findings from the report, we do want to flag that the full report is available to download. It just went live today. And on the screen you see a link, so it's http://bit.ly/RHF-cost-study. And you should be receiving an email, if you haven't done so already, from the Rick Hansen Foundation that will also be sharing the link to this study. And on this slide is just an image of what the cover of the study looks like. So this will be the full 300-page report where you'll be able to review a lot of the content that we'll be sharing today in detail. So don't worry if you want to look at diagrams a little bit more thoroughly. Our task with this study was to compare the Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certification Program to building code. And as you can see in this image of both of those documents, there's a lot of material captured in both of these. And our study objectives, there were three main objectives for the study. The first one was to compare all of the requirements between the Hansen program and code. And that was in order to fulfill our second objective, which was to determine the cost increase of new builds that are designed and constructed to achieve Hansen accessibility certification, specifically accessibility to reach accessibility certified goals, instead of solely to code. And we also hope that this study can be used by accessibility professionals, designers, and decision makers to advocate for accessibility. The documents, the exact documents that we compared, we used the Hansen Foundation's Accessibility Certification Rating Survey and Professional Handbook, and those were the 2018 versions. And as the Hansen program is 80% largely based on CSA B651, we also dug into the details of that standard. And then on the code side, we were comparing to the 2015 National Building Code and also the 2018 Ontario Building Code, because that code is one of the most advanced in the country. So we wanted to make sure we were comparing to what's seen as the most stringent code. In thinking about how to share the results of the study with you, we realized that the clearest and best way to do so is actually to walk you through the methodology that we undertook. So we will be going over three steps that we took. One was the first step was the comparison of all of the features in the Hansen program to code, which then allowed us to do step two, which is when we layered in the points system in the rating survey. And then that allowed us to proceed to step three, which was to really do that costing analysis that we were aiming for. So we'll jump into step one, all the groundwork, which was the comparison of the Hansen program features to code. And here we have a screenshot of looking at some of the features level. So within the category of sanitary facilities, the element 5.1 washrooms, we can see that there are several features, and it was this level that we were looking at. And we also pulled a screenshot here of, in the program handbook, all of the requirements and the details described for just one feature. So 5.1.6 for accessible universal washrooms. We can see that there are over a dozen individual requirements and details for just that one feature. So we wanted to share this just to highlight that in order to do the comparison accurately and with rigor, we actually compared every single one of these details, every single detail required for each feature to all relevant content in building code. And just to give you a bit of an idea of the extent of the detail involved in the work, this is an image of our colleague, Jason, who worked on the study with us, and he has two monitors side by side, and this shows the master Excel spreadsheet that we were using to track all of our comparison work. And this master spreadsheet, we actually ended up calling the monster, not the master, because it was over 600 rows long. we want to walk you through how we went about doing the comparison of the features. We created 5 different comparison categories that we could assign features to or slot features into. So the first one was understanding which features of the Hansen program are actually less stringent or less comprehensive than building code. There weren't many, but there are a few, such as the number of entrances required to be accessible in projects, or the clear width of interior stairs. And we did this partially to also flag for the foundation as they continue to evolve their content and standards, just some code detail they may want to look to. Our second comparison category is where the Hansen program and code were similar and effectively asked for the same design features and qualities. And then, some examples of where the Hansen program and code are similar include, for example, the force required, the specified maximum force required to open doors, details around stair height and tread depth, qualities around different surface qualities being stable and slip resistant. So those are some examples of where code actually was similar to the Hansen program. And then we have 3 remaining comparison categories, all of which fall under where the Hansen program is more stringent than code. And this first one here in the light orange, this is presenting features where the Hansen program is more stringent or comprehensive than code, but actually thoughtful design can mitigate any potential additional costs. So thoughtful design and planning can achieve those features. And we'll be speaking a lot about this category because we think it's really important and the takeaways were really interesting for our findings around that category. And this includes features such as making decisions around features such as ensuring that flooring and carpet is not strongly patterned, or ensuring that counters are accessible, or that tables are provided in accessible ways at appropriate and a variety of heights. So these are all things that just with good thoughtful design and planning should not, in our assessment, require additional cost. And we also realized, looking at all these features that should not require additional cost, that there were many themes for what these features were covering. So, for example, we have some images here that show Laura, once again, in our work with the City of Vancouver, we were just seeing features such as the location and positioning of elevator control panels, the location and positioning of mirrors, or even microwaves and even hooks. So all of these, there are accessible ways to position and locate these amenities, and care needs to be taken to ensure that they're done correctly, but none of this will accrue or incur additional costs. Also, the selection of materials and finishings, features related to those are also achievable without additional costs because it can involve, as we see in the images, representing ensuring that we have contrasting colors where that's needed, or ensuring that, for example, shower tiles are non-slip. And color contrasting, as you see on this side, we know that we can make decisions around paint colors and material colors, so that around door frames and elevator doors, and even with millwork and appliances, that tonal contrast is achieved to help with wayfinding and understanding our environment. There's also the theme of hardware and furniture that came through as features not requiring additional costs, so just specifying right off the bat appropriate hardware and furniture and we have some images here that show bathroom stall walks needing to be accessible, seating, ensuring that seating has backrests and armrests, ensuring that amenities such as checkout counters in libraries, that screens are at appropriate heights. These are all things that are achievable without additional cost.
The other theme that we saw related to the Hansen features that wouldn't actually add cost, but just through thoughtful design to be achieved, things that are related to the arrangement of objects in spaces. So things like simple choices around where garbage cans are located, things like that to not impede a path of travel. These are examples of, there's numerous examples like this that it's really just about operations and it's really just about being thoughtful in where you locate things. It has really no impact on cost. So these were all captured in this study. We like to share this image on the top left. There's an image of an accessible piece of equipment that was seen in a fitness center, but it is incorrectly located, so someone in a mobility device cannot actually access it. So it's through knowledge and thoughtful placement of objects similar to this that places can be, that we can provide more meaningful access.
So the last two comparison categories that we were using, this is where cost is involved. So for features where the Hansen program was more stringent than code and involved additional costs, these were features such as ensuring that pedestrian crossings have the proper visual and audible signals, the proper markings, and even features that are striving to achieve certain levels of illumination. So, for example, illumination levels in kitchens being the Rick Hansen program specifying higher levels than what's found in code. And finally, the last comparison category that we wanted to distinguish from the others is where the Rick Hansen program is more stringent than code, and those features, to achieve those features, would involve additional costs and also additional building area.
When we refer to building area, these are features that in order to achieve, the size of the building would actually have to get larger in order to meet the accessibility requirement, thus adding the cost to the project.
And a few examples of features that add cost and area include features that specify more stringent clear spaces for maneuvering and transferring, and also one that's really relevant to our work as a design and architecture firm are providing refuge areas on each floor.
Yeah, so as many of you are aware, areas of refuge are areas within a stairwell that are free of the path of travel, that provide a safe place for someone in a mobility device or someone that can't use the stairs, a place for them to wait and provide a safe place for them to wait in the case of a fire. So these are examples that are no longer required by building code, but to Rick Hansen it's still very important, and you'll see later on when we go through costing that this was an item that added significant cost to a project.
And how we are sharing this detailed comparison feature by feature and is actually in these tables that we created for each individual element in the program that goes through each feature and categorizes them by those 5 categories that we saw. So which features are similar to code, which ones involve additional costs, et cetera. And all of these details, the full details of this comparison is available in the report. And we also, in these tables, we've not only shared which comparison category each feature falls into, but also what you need to do above and beyond code to meet the Rick Hansen requirements. So it's very detailed.
We really hope that this could be used as a tool for you as designers, or if you're an accessibility professional, that you could then communicate this to designers to help them understand what they need to do above and beyond building code.
Exactly, yeah, because we clarified all of that in it. And we wanted to share this overall snapshot of the numbers of features that fall into each of those comparison categories. So this is a graph that's organized by the main Rick Hansen program categories. So from vehicular access through to interior circulation and trails and pathways. We can look at this overall graph to understand what was happening with the comparison features, the numbers of them. So if we look more specifically here at just vehicular access in its comparison to the National Building Code, NBC, we can see that 2 out of a total of 13 features for that building area were similar to code. 3 were greater than code, however, would require no additional cost. 4 were greater than code with additional cost, and then another 4 were greater than code with both additional cost and building area. And for the totals here, if we look, zoom into the totals, so for NBC, out of a total of nearly 600 features, 48% or 274 features land in that category of features achievable without additional cost, which we think is quite remarkable. If we take a look at the overall snapshot again for numbers of features and how they land in each comparison category, we wanted to flag that for category 9, residential units, we actually repeated it. We did it twice because we had to do it once for units in buildings that are less than 600 square meters, and again for units that are in buildings greater than 600 square meters, simply because code has different requirements for those two. So in order to be accurate with it, we split it up. And we did do a full comparison to NBC and also to OBC, the Ontario Code. And this snapshot shows how we can see that the Ontario Building Code is more stringent than the National Building Code. If we take a look at the gray bar at the left, those are features where code is actually more stringent than the Rick Hansen program. And we can see a greater number of them in the snapshot of the Ontario Code compared to the National Building Code. And again, we would love to draw your attention to the light bars in each, and those are the light blue and the light orange bars. Those are the ones that indicate the number of features that are in that special category where the features are achievable without additional cost.
All right, so we first heard Fiona ran through all the Rick Hansen features to building code. So this was a line-by-line comparison of all the features to all the related clauses in building code. And then what we had to do then, because the Rick Hansen system is a rating system that assigns points to achieve a certain score, we then had to layer in the points to understand how this comparison related to the Rick Hansen certification. So as you are likely aware, in order to achieve gold certification on the rating, you need to achieve a rating score of 80% or higher. In order to achieve Rick Hansen Accessibility Certified, you need to achieve a score between 60 and 79%. So this was our challenge, was to then take all the comparison that we did of all of the clauses in building code to features, and then layer in the number of points. So you can see on this screen capture, we have an image from the Rick Hansen handbook, and just to in case you're not aware, this is a screen capture from washrooms, and so 5.1.1 identifies power-operated doors. So adding a power-operated door to a washroom achieves a score of 5 points, whereas other things like adding clear width of entry would achieve a score of 3 points. And it was also complicated to do in that not every feature applied to every single building type. So on this screen, you can see an image of where we are looking at. You can look at some additional requirements that are required for restaurants and cafeterias and bars, and so these features and these points would not have been applied to other types of buildings, and so we had to take this into consideration when we were doing our comparison. And so what we did, because Rick Hansen looks at 4 different site types, there is public spaces, commercial spaces, multi-unit residential spaces, as well as trails and pathways. So what we did, we just looked at the building types. We didn't look at trails and pathways for this next analysis, but we then took an average of points of the 3 different building types and looking specifically at features that would apply to community centers, office buildings, and high-rise residential buildings. So we're excited to share this next, the next results with you. And so these are some of the key takeaways that we find really interesting. So what we learned, that if you're just meeting building code on a project and the construction of a new project, that you could achieve a score of 35% on the Rick Hansen rating system. So this is quite striking because what it tells us is that there's been 65% of the rating system that identifies all these important features that are not being met or addressed by building code. So this is our favorite slide actually, or my favorite slide. So when we then layer in all of the features that can be achieved without adding cost to a project just through thoughtful design, the results of the study identified that every project that's built could achieve a rating score of 70% without adding additional costs or without adding additional area to the project. So what this tells us is that basically every new build that's being built across Canada really should be meeting an accessible certified level. And then, of course, when we then layer in the features that add costs but don't add area, that brings us up to achieving 90% on the Rick Hansen rating system. And then, of course, that last 10% between 90 and 100, those are all the additional features that add costs and also add building area. Okay, so step 3. So we looked at the features, and then we related the features to code, and then we did the analysis related to the point system. And then what we really wanted to do was understand the cost of meeting these features. And so in order to do this, we did 7 different case studies of 7 different projects that HC may have designed over the past number of years as a way to actually test our assumptions and to understand the cost of meeting Rick Hansen certified goals. And it's important to note that when we did this case study, we were considering these as new builds. So as if you were building these new right from the beginning, we're not renovating these buildings. And so we looked at a secondary school, we looked at 2 community centers, we looked at 1 office building, we looked at a temporary housing facility because it was interesting to understand how the rating system and the costs would apply to looking at hotels. We also looked at a high-rise residential project and an affordable housing project. And so these projects were located across Canada, so that you see this image, a map of Canada, and identifying the locations of these projects. The projects also ranged in budget, which is important for us to understand too as part of the study. So they ranged from $7 million to $141 million in construction costs. And it's important to note that there was a series of assumptions, and we really wanted to be rigorous when we were doing this. So because we were comparing building code to the Rick Hansen, there was a lot of things that were that we did in these designs previously that were above building code already. So in the process of doing the cost comparison, we actually had to strip out a bunch of features that were just done because it was best practice. And so in order to actually get a comparison to building code, we had to then remove stuff almost from projects. It's important to note that this is for new construction, and that the costing that was done is considered a Class C costing. So this is a very typical costing that's done on feasibility studies, and it has a range of plus or minus 25% in accuracy. So the projects ranged in scale from 2,400 meters squared up to just under 40,000 square meters, so very different sizes. And so what we're going to do is share with you the results of the case studies and the percentage of cost increase needed to meet Rick Hansen certified goals in each of these projects. And we also wanted to share with you just a few examples where these features added significant cost in the case of these typologies. So first we looked at a secondary school. And the results of the case study identified that a secondary school could achieve gold certification with only an increase of construction costs by 0.5%. And so you can see here in this graph that MBC and OBC were very similar for this typology. And so this is just meeting gold certification. This is not doing every single feature that's identified in the Hansen rating system. And so some examples where significant costs were added to a project when looking at meeting the Hansen certification program, things related to adding full shelter over top of designated accessible stalls, that added considerable cost. Also, an interesting point, building code does not require that you add shelter for weather protection at entrances. It's a requirement, it's a feature in Hansen. And so this is something that adds considerable cost to a project, but really it is just best practice. And so here's an image on the screen of this school that we designed. And really what it identifies to me is that building codes need to adjust, and that this is something that needs to be included in building code. Things like washrooms, because in schools there are so many different washrooms, and washrooms are such a critical aspect related to accessibility, and there's so many different features. So we saw a significant cost increase related to washrooms. Also acoustics in spaces, because for Hansen 4.5.1 sound dampening where spoken word is expected. So adding optics to spaces, we saw a significant cost increase in the school typology. We also looked at 2 different community centers. So here are some images of the first one that we looked at, and each of them had different types of spaces in them, so it was important for us to analyze different typologies. This is the second one that had different features in it, like a field house, this had a swimming pool. And so when we took the average of the cost comparison that we did for both of these different case studies, what we saw as the result was that a community center could achieve gold certification with a 1% cost increase. So this slide here has a plan of one of the community centers, and you can see we just highlighted the accessible universal washroom, and adding adult change tables is a requirement or a feature of Hansen that adds significant cost. It also adds area. We also believe that this is something that really should just be inserted and be part of building code, especially for these types of public spaces. But it was factored into our costing. Also looking at swimming pools, adding ramps, accessible access into swimming pools, this added considerable cost and area to projects. And of course, adding areas of refuge. What's interesting is that at times it's actually easy to add an area of refuge depending on the configuration of the stairs, but in other instances it's actually more challenging. And so depending on the number of floors you have, it becomes more or less costly to add areas of refuge. On this page you have an image of the office building that we did the case study on. And the results of the case study identified that an office building could achieve gold certification with only a 0.5% construction cost increase. And some of the key interesting findings related to cost on this case study, making sure that a parkade had the appropriate height clearance for vans, things like that, that added significant cost to the project. We looked at the temporary housing project. Here's a few images of the temporary housing project we looked at. And the results of the study identified that a temporary housing project could achieve gold certification with just under 2% construction cost increase. And some of the examples where significant cost was added for this typology related to adding adequate number of rooms to make them accessible, also making sure that they're distributed throughout a facility. And we looked at a high-rise residential tower. And so in this case here, the case study looked at 2 towers, each 33 stories tall, and each of them had townhouses on the base, as well as a number of amenities and underground parking. So this is a very common typology. We thought it was a very important one for us to look at as part of the study, because we see it so widely. The results of the study identified that a high-rise residential tower could achieve gold certification with just under 0.5% of cost increase. And to be expected, some of the things that added significant cost to these projects, you can see on this image, we have a plan that highlights the exit stairs, and so adding areas of refuge to every single floor, because there's 33 floors on each tower, so that's 56 floors, and the stairs are often designed to intertwine, so you have to have double the areas of refuge on each floor, so it added significant cost to these projects. And of course, another feature that added cost, which is also very important, is ensuring that you have clear maneuvering space in areas like kitchens. And then we also looked at an affordable housing project on the island that we've designed. And what was interesting about this one is that it's a smaller project, but an affordable housing project could achieve gold certification with just under 2% cost increase. And what we see as one of the key barriers for this project is not necessarily building code, because building code is actually things. There's other regulations that are applied by municipalities, urban design guidelines that tell you that you have to have a raised entry adjacent to a sidewalk. So we see this all the time in townhouses where because of urban design guidelines, they want a certain condition in relationship to the sidewalk that creates separation. But in doing that, in creating that urban design realm that is separated, now these units are no longer accessible. So this is not necessarily a building code, but it's actually, there's other things that layer into why these typologies aren't meeting best practices. So there's a few factors affecting the differences in cost impact that we want to raise, and the results that we found. So it's really the size of the project. So what we found is that larger projects in size resulted in a smaller increase in the construction cost increase to achieve gold certification, and vice versa. The smaller projects actually required a greater percentage to achieve gold certification, and I think this could be thought of quite easily if you think of adding a power-operated door to the main entry. You take the cost of that power-operated door for a large facility versus a small facility, and it has a much different effect on the percentage of cost increase. Also things like the size and presence of parking lots and how big they are, because there's lots of requirements related to parking and drop-off. So that also had a big impact on the cost comparison.
So overall, we want to re-emphasize a few takeaways here. As we've said before, we believe that building codes really are the worst that we can do, and that we should strive for more. And because every project, our analysis has revealed, should be able to meet accessibility certified without any additional cost, we think that that should happen. We think that every project should be striving to be accessibility certified. This graph represents the cost increase from our case studies if projects were to strive to achieve every single feature in the Rick Hansen program. So to achieve a score of 100%, the average cost increase across typologies was approximately 6%. However, to achieve gold, accessibility certified gold, the average was 1%, and that's where that 1% comes back in. And we think that this is quite neat that that 1% actually goes a really long way in the number of features that you can achieve, because it bumps up for NBC. It would bump up your score from 70% up to 80%, or sorry, up to 80%. So that means that extra 1% of construction costs can actually affect a lot and influence the accessibility of a project quite a bit. if we all allocate just 1% of a project's construction budget, we can build truly accessible buildings. We really believe that we need an attitude change in the building and construction industry, that we need to think more broadly about inclusivity and about what meaningful accessibility means and how we can achieve it. And we need better standards and more consistent standards, and that's why we are excited about the Rick Hansen program. And it's also so important that we share strategies and successes with each other to help us reach our collective goals. Finally, we would like to leave you with a question for us to each ask ourselves, and that is really what's possible and what can we each do in terms of striving for greater accessibility. Thank you so much. On the screen are our email addresses, a.callison@hcma.ca and f.jones@hcma.ca, and feel free to reach out to us at any time if we don't manage to cover critical questions in the final minutes that we have remaining with you today.
Thanks, Fiona and Aidan. That was a great presentation. I think we all learned a lot of practical information and how it relates to RHFAC. Your examples were very helpful. We have time to answer a couple of questions, and I've written down 2 questions here. And the rest of the questions that were missed will be posted on the APN forum, and if you have further questions, they can be posted on the forum. So here's the first 2 questions. How many accessible suites are needed for multi-unit residential development?
So Uli, I am actually just diving into some documents right now because I want to get that answer. So I saw that through the chat.
I can give you another question then.
Yeah, and it's actually it'll be a nuanced answer, as there'll also be 2 different answers depending on the size of the building that the suites are located in. So we can delve into that in more detail offline.
Okay, and also thank you for mentioning areas of refuge that is often overlooked. And the other question was, did the study use B651-12 or B651-18?
We used
in the
-18 version.
Okay, thank you.
So B61, -18.
Okay, and another question is, why was the BC not used in the comparison?
That's a really good question, and to be honest, ideally we could have done the comparison against every single building code across the country, but that would have required a lot of work. It would have been very exhaustive. And so what was decided with Rick Hansen was that we'd look at the National Building Code, because the National Building Code is the model building code that influences other building codes. We do recognize that there is numerous provinces have their own building codes, and then also cities like Vancouver have their own building codes. So there is differences, of course.
Okay. Another question is, how does the cost of RHFAC compare to LEED certification?
That's a really great question. And I think one that we can ask our colleagues about who work extensively with LEED. We can see if they have some comparable analysis that we could use to compare to this.
Yeah, because I know with LEED, it's the cost. There's costs associated with actually making the changes, meeting better energy standards, things like that. But it's also the cost associated with tracking. And so there's actually a considerable cost, or there is a cost associated with that as well. So it's something that we could dial in, but it would be a lot more than 1%, and a lot more than the cost of certification that's required for Rick Hansen versus LEED.
All right. Another comment is, you referenced a document for designing universal change rooms. What was it called, and where can it be assessed or accessed?
Oh, you're talking about, that's great. So this is a document that HCMA published, Designing for Inclusivity, and its design strategies for universal washrooms and change rooms. And so this can be found on HCMA's website.
Yeah, we have an open assets section of our website And the document, people have found it useful because it delves into not just the design strategies, but also some of the context and history around why universal washrooms and change rooms are becoming more and more prevalent and more important.
Yeah, we worked with a group called Transfocus on that document as well as the City of Surrey to develop the design guidelines. So we're very proud of it. Yeah.
Okay. Last question. Could you please clarify, when you speak of additional cost increases of 1%, is it really true construction costs that include materials and labor, or just the design cost alone?
Oh, good. That's a good question. So for the purposes of the cost analysis that we did, it was construction costs. So it didn't factor in what we might call soft costs that would relate to design. But in my mind, from my perspective, it shouldn't actually take additional costs to design to meet best practices in accessibility. It's really just about the knowledge. And in some cases, actually, what you need is an accessibility professional, like number of people on this panel or people that are Hansen certified. And so there is cost related to that to gain that knowledge. But I don't believe it should cost additional to add to design to meet the Hansen certification program.
Thanks, Aidan and Fiona. I have a couple last comments to make here. The 1-month grace period for your APN membership ends on January 31st, which means this is the last webinar you will be able to access without renewing it for 2020. If you haven't done so, please renew your membership by the end of January to ensure you don't lose access to the APN resource. In addition to the monthly webinars, we will be continuing to add resources such as marketing tools, presentation templates, and more throughout 2020. You can renew your membership or become a member by logging into the APN website. If you have any difficulties, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We would really like to hear about any technical or accessibility issues you have with the renewal process. And this concludes our webinar for today. We thank our guests, Aidan and Fiona, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.